Okay, we are live, and I'm just checking on my phone to see if the live stream is coming through independent of my computer. But we will be talking about ADA Title II today, and for so many public entities, this is something that's new to them, and there are many different aspects of compliance that they need to consider. So we're going to go over many of those aspects today. It is so important that you know what the actual update to regulation is, what all of the requirements are, but also the exceptions, so that you're not working on things that you don't unnecessarily need to. So I'm just going back to the stream that you don't unnecessarily need to. And it is live. So we're good. I'm going to go ahead and we're going to go not to the ADA Title II Resource Center. We will get to that momentarily. But for now, let's look at the new Title II rule. And it is, I have it pulled up, ADA Title II Resource Center. Okay, well, we'll just go ahead and I can enter in the URL directly, ADA Title II Web Accessibility. And then so now we're here, and let's just go through this. And this is actually, think of this as the fact sheet with expanded, with more detail and more practical information to help you work through compliance and all of the requirements. So we have this here, and I'm going to scroll through this. The first thing is that Title II applies to state and local governments, but that's going to include all of the associated public entities. So obviously that's important to know, because when you first hear state and local governments, especially if Title II hasn't applied to you, you may think it's just about state and local governments, but it's much, much more. So we'll scroll down and we have the mention to the live stream. So we're streaming live. Hopefully we can get some more people that are looking at the Title II page to come on the stream. But there are, we're just looking at the table of contents right now. There's so much information that's applicable here. And let's just look at generally what is required under the law. So to remain compliant, by the compliance date, state and local governments must make their websites, their web content, their mobile apps, and their documents WCAG 2.1 AA conformant. And we will go over WCAG 2.1 AA. That is actually the next section. But really, that is what so much of compliance comes down to. And it doesn't matter whether you're covered by Title II, whether you are a public entity in Colorado, so you're working with HB 21-1110, or you are covered by the recent update to the recent HHS update. So the recent update issued by the Department of Health and Human Services. This information today will help you all. All right, so when we get to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, think of these as technical standards for web accessibility. They're not going to apply perfectly to digital assets. So think of mobile apps, think of documents. They don't apply perfectly because they are intended for web-based assets. So when I say web-based assets, just think of everything that you can access by a web browser. That is what the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are intended for. But even if we're working with a different digital asset, the principles are still going to apply. So even if it's not if it's not like a web-based thing, the principles from the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines will still apply. And we'll cover WCAG, and I have guides on this. We can cover WCAG much, much more. But for now, I want to go over the different specifics to the update to regulation. So who is covered? All state and local public entities. And so I have many different examples on this page, and I will link to this page in the description. It really does capture all of the requirements, everything that you need to know from this new update. So we have state and local government offices, obviously, social services included in that, employment services included in that, educational institutions. This is big. So all public and elementary schools, all community colleges, all public universities, law enforcement, emergency services, judicial systems, healthcare facilities, any entity that's connected to the public needs to be compliant. And then I have also here public libraries and public transit agencies. Obviously, it's not limited to these different entities, but this gives you a really good idea of who is covered. Now, moving on to private contractors. You might not expect private entities to be covered by Title II, but private entities can be. And the way this happens is if they are contracted with the public entities to provide services, to provide programs. Here I have transportation services, retail services. I thought this was interesting. If a convenience store sells lottery tickets for the state, then the store is serving a public function. So they are also covered by Title II. Importantly, educational services are also covered by Title II when the educational service provider is contracted with the public entity, then they are covered. The same applies to social services and healthcare services. So you can see there are a lot of different entities beyond public entities that ADA Title II can apply to. So some of these different companies, some of these different service providers, they may not know that they're covered, but as a public entity, you also need to make your contractors well aware that any services they provide, anything that they are providing and that's routed through the digital realm, that's going to be made accessible. So that is a very important aspect of this, but it's not one that is talked about a lot. This is something where you have to specifically contract to this and make sure that your provider is paying attention. Because if your provider is offering services or providing services on your behalf, then you can potentially be responsible for those services. In fact, you likely are, because you're not going to be able to delegate responsibility and say, well, they provided the services. Ultimately, they are routing through you, so it's your responsibility as well. But these entities, these different private entities, will be covered by Title II. So that is important to know. It's often overlooked. I don't see this talked about a lot, but private contractors are covered by ADA Title II, and then public entities need to be aware that they need to make sure that these private contractors are making sure that the services they are providing are accessible. All right, so special district governments are also covered. And so what are special district governments? Well, these are independent government units that are created for a limited specific purpose, and they come and go really, really fast, but special district governments are also covered by this new update. So here I have the 3 keys to remember with special districts is they are independent government units, they are created for a specific purpose, and they exist separately from the local governments. So they just think of them as providing specific functions. So what could be a specific function? So each special district could provide a specific service, and that might be to provide water supply, sewage treatment, fire protection, park services, etc. So just think about, if you're providing services to the public, then you're probably covered. And here we have special district governments that are covered by this new rule as well. So I think more entities are covered by ADA Title II than is known. So what are the exceptions under the new rule? This is really important because we don't want to work on things that we don't have to work on, right? We've already got enough to do. So we definitely don't want to start working on, let's say, documents that we don't have to make compliant ahead of this deadline. So let's go over the 5 exceptions named. They are archived web content, pre-existing electronic documents, content posted by an independent third party, individualized documents that are password protected, and pre-existing social media posts. All right, so that is it generally, but there are very important details that you need to be aware of. All right, so with web content, you have to meet all of the following 4 points for for your web content to be qualified as an exception. So the content needs to be created before the deadline for compliance, or the content reproduces paper documents or contents of other physical media. So just think of like dated media, like it would be CDs, for example, that were created before the date of compliance. The content is only for reference, research, or record keeping purposes. The content is specifically is held in a section specifically for archived content. So this content is marked as archived content, and the content has not been updated or changed since being archived. So there's an underlying theme here, and that is that this content is not active. If you have an active document that's being used, that wouldn't be considered an archived document, or it wouldn't be considered under this archived web content umbrella. So keep that in mind. You have to meet all 4 of these points to have content that's considered archived. And one important one is you need to specifically mark it as archived content. And then the other important part, it's a reoccurring theme. If a document is active, if it's being used, right? If you're using this document for people to fill out for some reason or another, then obviously that's not going to qualify for this exception. All right, so now we have pre-existing traditional documents. So the DOJ has really helped out public entities by not requiring all of, like, not only the archived web content, but these pre-existing documents. So the way you qualify for this exception is you have a document, so it's a Word document, it could be Google Docs, etc. You have a PowerPoint, you have a PDF or a spreadsheet. So those are the traditional documents, and the documents were available on the state or local government's website or mobile app before the date of compliance. So this is just recognizing that there are so many documents that are out there, and it's impossible. It's going to be impossible to remediate all of the documents before this deadline. So the DOJ, understanding this practical reality, has provided this exception for documents that are pre-existing. And then we have content posted by a non-affiliated third party. So this is actually a fairly light exception, and we shouldn't see this come up too much. But just think about if somebody posts a message on your social media after the compliance date, you're not going to be responsible if, let's say, they upload an image and that image does not have the appropriate alt text. Obviously, that would be something that's outside of your control. So I like this exception, but this isn't something that we need to read into too much. We just be aware that you're not going to be responsible for content that is posted by a third party. And then we also have individual password protected documents, and this is one of the more it's not necessarily controversial, but argued exceptions. So beyond the old documents, the DOJ also provided an exception for individual password protected documents. So a good example is a water bill, and it has to meet these 3 conditions. The documents are the traditional documents that I referred to earlier, so spreadsheets, Word documents, PDFs, presentations. The documents are for a specific person, property, or account, so there's that specificity angle, and the documents are password protected. If all 3 of the conditions are met, then this would be qualified for an exception, or this would fall under the individual password protected documents exception. And then we have pre-existing social media posts. So just know that any posts that are made to social media before the compliance date, you don't have to go back and fix all of the old posts or start deleting posts. This is just aware that this is the DOJ being aware that, okay, people have posted content. This has been ongoing. They weren't aware or thinking about of accessibility potentially. And so now we'll just make it that for all content that's posted after the compliance date, that needs to be in compliance, but if it's before, then it meets this exception. All right, so going over the deadlines, you either have 2 years or you have 3 years for compliance. And so the determining factor is population. So if you're a public entity in a population of 50,000 or less, then you have 3 years. And then if you are a public entity of 50,000 or more, of a population of 50,000 or more, then you have 2 years. And then for special district governments, they also have 3 years. What is so important is that this is not a lot of time. When it comes to digital accessibility, things take time. And it just, even if you're an expert in accessibility, even if you already have an accessibility coordinator, this takes time because there is the technical aspect of this. There is the complexity aspect of this. So as we're going through the different digital assets, some are more complex than others. And there is just this sheer manual work involved that just takes time. And so even if you have one person who is dedicated to accessibility, they're not going to be able to meet this deadline in most circumstances. So the deadline is coming up fast. If you haven't started on this, then you're already falling behind. And I can tell you what will happen is as the deadline draws near, there will be more of a rush on service providers, and the service providers are going to have slower turnaround times, and it's going to be very difficult to meet these compliance dates if you wait towards the end compliance date. So what I highly recommend is you get started now so that you have more. You're going to be more comfortable in compliance. But if you wait, it is very likely that you will not meet this compliance date. And the state of Colorado has already found this out firsthand. What happened is the state of Colorado gave 3 years advance notice, and I think a relatively few amount of entities that were covered by the state law took action. And then what happened? They actually had to extend the deadline because not enough. Nobody would have, not nobody, but like most of the public entities wouldn't have been in compliance. That extension is not coming right under Title II. The Title II has been set out. They have made this very clear. The deadlines are very clear. What they haven't done is they haven't explained the practical reality of working towards WCAG 2.1 AA for all of these different digital assets, especially when you consider that different public entities have multiple websites, they might have multiple mobile apps, their budgets may be limited, their internal knowledge may be limited. It's going to take time to work towards compliance. So I can already anticipate what's going to happen. There are going to be literally thousands of public entities that they're going to start working in the last, let's say, 8 months, and they're going to quickly realize that they have more than they can do. And then when they go to the service providers are going to be more expensive because they're going to have a backload of clients. And so that's going to happen. So if you start now, though, you're ahead of the game. You can comfortably work towards compliance. It won't. You won't spend as much because you won't be in a hurry, and you won't be making. One of the things that's going to happen is when you're in a hurry, when you know there's a compliance date that's imminent and it's upcoming, you start to make bad decisions. And with accessibility, you don't want to make bad decisions, because let me tell you what has happened to so many different people, and this is beyond public entities. This is everybody. They rush into accessibility, and many times in the past, it's been because of a lawsuit. So they rush into accessibility. They start talking to a digital accessibility company, and they are sold on something that does not help them, that they do not need, and they waste thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars, often on software that does them nothing. The digital accessibility companies, they paint a good picture, they tell a good story, they make you think that what you're getting is what you need, and it's not. And you're sold a package of different things, and you are rerouted away from what you actually need, but you trust these people to some degree because they are supposed to be the experts. Well, the experts tell you what they want to sell you, but they don't necessarily tell you what you need. And if you rush to a decision and your procurement team is hurrying up and everything sounds good, so why not? Let's go ahead and make this deal. There has been literally hundreds of millions of dollars wasted on accessibility software that is not going to advance you to WCAG 2.1 AA compliance. you need the manual services, and you need to be able to, it's not just the fact that it's a manual service, you need to be able to take the time to evaluate the different service providers. You also need to take the time to train in-house and understand the web content accessibility guidelines. So that makes sense, right? If we're working towards compliance with this law, we not only need to understand what the law is, but we need to understand what the law is or what we need to do to be in compliance with the law. So knowing the requirements is one thing, but how do you actually meet the requirements? And these are things that you want to think about before you ever talk to a seller. Before you even start researching, you need to understand what you're buying. A lot of times what I do is I'm helping clients understand what they actually need versus telling them the different products and services that I offer. Obviously, there's some overlap there, but a lot of people don't even understand what they need. And because of that, and because, as we're talking here about the deadline, because of that, they make poor decisions, and that will really prevent you from even coming close to compliance. Let's say you go buy a platform, or you go and you purchase a scanning software. That's just going to take you away from where you want to be, and you're going to unnecessarily waste your budget. So the compliance deadlines are big, and thinking about this ahead of time is a big deal. So you want to prepare, you want to spend time, you want to be able to take time internally and understand what you need before you ever talk to a service provider. And that leads to my next section here in this guide, is what services are needed for Title II compliance. Well, an accessibility audit is going to be necessary. And just thinking about a website, let's use the website example and stay with that. Obviously, there are other digital assets, but just to keep this simple, we need to audit our website so that we know what accessibility issues there are. Because if we're working towards WCAG 2.1 AA conformance, then we need to know everything that could possibly take us out of conformance. And then we need to remediate those issues. So once we find all of the issues, then we remediate the issues. And then I highly recommend user testing. Now, the reason I recommend user testing so much is because it's not necessary, it's not absolutely necessary, right? We can have a WCAG 2.1 AA conformant website through just an audit and remediation. And then after audit and remediation, you want to go in and make sure that the issues that were found in the audit were actually fixed. But with user testing, you have someone, an accessibility professional who is blind or visually impaired and using a screen reader and relaying their practical experience. And if you have this documented, that is extremely compelling should anybody claim that there are accessibility issues that exist on your website. And this could be, we've seen in the private space how often plaintiffs' lawyers are engaged in serial litigation, and they are just abusing the legal system over and over again. And we want to make sure that we have a defense for that. And what better defense than to have a statement or have a recorded session from a user testing session that shows demonstrably that your website or other digital asset is accessible. So I highly recommend user testing because it really seals this all up. And then of course, when it comes to documents, we don't have an audit and remediation. We just go straight into remediation. So that's one difference with documents. But that's for the website side of this. And with mobile apps, you're going to have the same, you're going to have a very similar process, if not the same. And then training is going to be huge in this. We need to make sure that internally, once we've got to this point where we have this accessible website, that we're not making updates or, our contractors not coming in and having code updates to where we are taking ourselves out of WCAG 2.1 AA conformance. So it's very important that we build knowledge and expertise in-house. And so expertise, obviously, that's going to come over time, but we want to start training as soon as possible so that we can understand what WCAG 2.1 AA is, what it involves, but we also want to make sure that we understand what we need to do. and how we stay conformant. So we want to get into practice of making sure that our processes incorporate accessibility and that we're not making any changes that are going to take us out of conformance after we've spent all that money and all that time making our website WCAG conformant. All right, so when you in terms of budgeting, when you think about prices, some of the considerations that we're going to go through are the state of accessibility. When it comes to websites, the number of pages and scope, the complexity or simplicity of a website, and or potentially the platform that the website is built on. So the technology that you're using for your website. And then I have a section on making mobile apps WCAG 2.1 AA conformant. And this gets back to what I was talking about, is how the principles will apply, but some of the success criteria may not apply evenly. And then, so I have a link here to a guide from the W3C about applying WCAG to, and then here, of course, they use very technical wording, to non-web information and communications technologies. But this guide helps your developers with working towards conformance for non-web assets. So then I have a section on how long will it take to be compliant with Title II. So just think about one website. It's usually going to take 2 to 3 months from an audit including an audit and remediation. And that's on a quicker, more accelerated timeline. Mobile apps are about the same. So that's just one website and or one mobile app. So go ahead and just think about that, and think about any other additional assets that you have. This can take time. This can take much more than 2 to 3 months. For a project, I think conservatively, for many of the public entities, you're looking at 2 years. That's really what it's going to take. This usually takes longer than you think it will versus shorter than you think it will. So, don't plan to have everything done perfectly right away. Plan for everything to take longer than you think, like maybe 1.3 times longer than you think, and then you'll be better off if you plan conservatively on that. So you definitely don't want to wait anywhere close to the compliance deadline. In fact, there's a reason the DOJ gave 2 or 3 years for compliance. You have to keep that in mind. They didn't just give 2 or 3 years because they felt like it. That's because it was absolutely necessary. So it's likely for some entities, it's going to take longer depending on how many digital assets you have. And by the way, if anybody has a question on anything I'm saying right now, go ahead and add that to the chat, and I will answer questions. So how should you start working towards compliance? Well, in this guide, which again I will link to in the description, I have a chronological order. So, and this is obviously it's a general chronology, but this will help you as you start to come up with how you're going to progress and how you're going to approach compliance. So first, I have studied the DOJ's fact sheet. I would also study this guide because this guide's more specific, but study the fact sheet, know exactly what is required and what is not. I would then form a digital accessibility committee of at least 2 people. And so you want to appoint one person as the accessibility coordinator. And this is extremely important because we need someone to organize our efforts. And I've already seen job postings for accessibility coordinators. Many of the job postings actually require a lot from the coordinator in terms of experience for the applicants. You're likely going to have to settle on someone that doesn't have the experience and the qualifications that you're looking for based on what I'm seeing in these job postings, just because the number of people who have expertise, who are familiar with WCAG 2.1 AA, who have the certifications, etc., it's not as many as you think. Digital accessibility is not as large as you think. Again, that goes back to why I was saying if you wait, you might have trouble finding a good service provider who can provide you all of the services you need ahead of time. So, and And so when you're forming a committee, once you have that accessibility coordinator, it's best to include people from different departments so that everybody's aware of what's happening. So IT, legal, and finance are 3 good departments to include to bring in on your committee. And this is so they understand what is necessary to be compliant, and they can inform the different people in their departments. And then I have, as the third step, start training on WCAG 2.1 AA right away. This will help you make better decisions in procurement, better decisions in making a timeline, and deciding what digital assets and content to prioritize. I have the WCAG course. This is going to provide exactly what you need to understand WCAG 2.1 AA. It's also going to help, again, it's going to make you have better, more informed decisions. So learning the web content accessibility guidelines should be one of the first things that you do. You also need to take an inventory of all of your digital assets. So here we're getting to the organization of things. What are we actually working on? Our websites, our web content, our social media channels. Even if we're not working on social media right now, this is going to be after the compliance date that we need to make sure everything is accessible. We need to start having the processes in place. We need to start getting into the habit of creating accessible social media, or else that could lead to problems, right? Like if we don't work on social media at all until the compliance deadline, and then we tell our social media manager, okay, make sure everything's accessible, that's going to lead to problems. So we need to start developing the processes to have everything in place. So when the compliance date hits, we're already integrating and incorporating accessibility into our processes. And the same can be said for documents and mobile apps. And then on the next step, I have to devise a budget for service work, consultation, and further training. This stuff costs money, and one of the reasons it costs money is because it's so time intensive, and another reason is because not that many people have the skills necessary to proficiently work on accessibility. So it just takes money, and originally you're going to outsource work to service providers because you just don't have the knowledge, expertise, and or infrastructure necessary to carry out all of this accessibility work. Let me give you an example. Even if you have an accessibility coordinator who is knowledgeable on accessibility, they might not have the web development skills to implement all of the requirements in the web content accessibility guidelines. So you would still need to source out remediation. So there's work that needs to be done that you're going to have to outsource because you're still unfamiliar with accessibility. So you need to provide for a budget for that, or else you're going to run into a problem where you need work done and there's just not the money necessary to get it done. And you also need to prioritize accessibility work. So you may have other projects that you're working on, but accessibility work needs to be prioritized because you have to get this done as soon as possible. And then that leads to my next point, which is creating a timeline to make all of your content and assets fully WCAG conformant. This is all leading into the accessibility policy, which is actually my next point. But we need to have a timeline at which we can expect all of this work to be done. So we're organizing everything. And then here I have develop an accessibility policy for responsibilities, actions, processes, reporting, documentation, and deadlines. We need a centralized hub to keep us organized. If we don't have this document that's keeping us organized, we're going to be working on projects. We're not going to know who's working on what. We're going to have projects that don't end up being completed. I've seen that happen so many times where a project starts, everything is good to begin with, but then it falls off. We don't know what ended up happening. We had an audit conducted. We got the audit back. We started working on it. We consulted with the service provider, but it ended up falling off, and we started working on something else. We got distracted, and then what happened? All of that work was done, and then ultimately we still have accessibility issues on the website, so we still have a problem. And what happens is you end up having to start all over again because changes changes are made to the website, and then updates are made, code is changed. We have a website redesign, and we have to start all over. No training was implemented. So this is why it's so important that we are organized, everything is in sync, and our departments are in sync so that nobody's working against us. That's another really important part of this, is we have to make sure that everybody's on the same page, everybody's prioritizing accessibility, and nobody is undoing the work that we've done. We have to take this seriously because there's so much attention to detail involved. And if you're not detail oriented, if you're not on top of your game, everything will fall apart on you. Let's see. And then I have begin internal work researching service providers. So again, service providers are necessary, but the good part is this isn't an ongoing cost forever, right? So when you're planning your budget, we can actually, if you get the bulk of the work done up front, then we can start tapering off the cost to, we get to a point where, let's say we're at year 2 or year 3 and our cost falls off a cliff. How do we get our cost to fall off a cliff? Well, we start to develop proficiency and expertise internally. We make sure that our contractors are agreeing that they will make assets, any updates, WCAG 2.1 AA conformant. And so when we have that knowledge in-house, we will need less and less work from service providers. And that's the end goal. We don't want to, sometimes digital accessibility companies will tell you the phrase accessibility is a journey, and that is code for we have you on a subscription and we want you to pay for it as long as we can possibly extract money from you. No, you actually want to get out of the accessibility subscription model, right? We don't need a subscription for this. Sometimes a subscription may be warranted, right? Maybe you don't want to do the work, but that should be your option. It shouldn't be an absolute necessity. So where possible, make sure that we are working to incorporate accessibility into what we do and develop expertise to where it's really an additional skill set that our team is really taking on and adding to their resume, so that we're not constantly we don't constantly have to source out accessibility. It's something that we can do at our option if we want to. So that's why it's so important that we have training. And then I have, let's see, I put number 9, begin internal work researching. 10, outline a vendor selection and procurement policy. This is not only going to apply to accessibility service providers, it's also going to apply to all of the different digital products and services that we procure. We need to have a filtration system to make sure that we are getting the most accessible products and services possible relative to how much we can spend and what our needs are. You also want to consider that. What do I actually need from this product or service? And is that accessible? So maybe there might be an instance where there's a product that we're buying, but we're only using one aspect of the product. Then that's something that we want to take into account when we are procuring. But procurement is very, very important, because going back to something I said earlier, if you are working with a company or a vendor who is producing products that have accessibility issues, you may not know it, and you may be relying upon that product. And then what happens, let's say it's a mobile app. What happens is you have this mobile app and you're putting it out there and it has accessibility issues, and you're not even aware because you contracted with this vendor who promised you they produced an ACR, or what is commonly referred to as a VPAT. They've produced this ACR, it says they're accessible, but they actually aren't. So you need to, that's why proficiency in-house really helps, because you can start to identify which vendors are genuine, which vendors are not. You can also start to review accessibility on your own and start to evaluate that way. But going back to the policy, this is why we have a process in place to make sure that we reduce the chance of this happening as much as possible. There will be problems with vendors, and I can already tell you it happens in the accessibility industry. Even with just document remediation, there are services that offer document remediation. I'm thinking specifically of PDFs, and they return PDFs that are not fully accessible. Do they work on some aspects of accessibility? Yes. Do they work on all? No. Do you know it? No. So that's a problem, and that can happen with anything. That can happen with products, platforms that you use. That can happen with plugins that you use, integrations, etc. So you have to be really, really careful when you are relying upon third-party software, integrations, etc. And then on my next point, I have execute the policy and then you have to begin work. So we have to have this policy, but we have to take real steps. We don't want to be caught in the organization phase of this for too long because we have to get moving. Again, we only have 2 or 3 years. We've already had research. Training is ongoing. So training should be concurrent with all of the other actions you are taking. There's just a lot to do, and that's why we have all of the steps we do. That's why we have an accessibility coordinator to help us organize. And then on the last part, I have continue on with training and development. So as I'm going through this, you're probably starting to notice this is a lot more involved than what you thought. But when you're organized, when you have a timeline, when you're disciplined, when you make sure that you work with the right people, this becomes much more simple and much more easy. You know, where things start to fall apart is where you don't take the time to research, you gloss over training, where you just work with any vendor who meets the price that you're looking for, then things start to fall apart. So it's a very meticulous process, but if you do it right, you will meet your compliance deadline. And then I have some more information on the new rule, and I'm not going to go over this because I have other things that I wanted to get to, and we are already, how far are we? We're 2/3 the way through this. One note here, I do have an ADA Title II Resource Center. This Resource Center, if you leverage it, will save you at least 10 hours of time. And one way it saves time is through this project platform. And it's really just a different sheets inside of a Google Sheets document. And this project platform helps you organize your efforts, what you're working on, and the different roles and responsibilities, how to take digital inventory. And it's not meant to really seal you into just this Google Sheets, but it gives you a base to start from, and then you can start customizing the platform to meet your specifications and your what you need to organize your project. Also, for getting started, I have different videos. I have so many different videos on ADA Title II compliance and working through it, planning your budget, procuring services, dealing with ACRs and VPATs. I have videos on all of those. I also have a guide to how to write an accessibility policy. But even beyond this guide, what I also have is an accessibility policy template. So this template gives you the ability to just have this out of the box, use as your base, and then customize it to fit what you need. And then obviously you can add to it, but you have this base. And I can tell you, I mean, just for me to write it alone took, I think I spent at least 10 hours on it, right? So coming back to it, editing it, making sure that the different considerations were embedded in it, and then you can take this, leverage it. So that's there for you. So is an accessibility statement template. So know that there is a difference between the policy and the statement. The statement is external, it's public facing. The policy is internal. So you want to make sure that there are just relevant. There are details in a policy that aren't relevant for public consumption. And then I also have guides on accessibility. So there is my course, but there's also a free WCAG guide and checklist. And then there are also, of course, the resources offered or the services offered by accessible.org. And then we can also help you with live training and consultation, technical consultation, etc. So this ADA Title II Resource Center is a great place to start and just start reading through some of the documentation and looking through the various links. So I will include this in the description. And then I have a few more articles posted on accessible.org. One of these is on the DOJ's Small Entity Compliance Guide. So I do think it's good that you see what the DOJ is posting. That's why I referenced their fact sheet. That's why I'm referencing this guide, because the DOJ is the source here, right? We want to make sure we're aligned with what the DOJ has put out. That's what I do with these different references and guides that I put out. But it is good to know, to go back and check with the source to make sure that you're aligned. And so the DOJ posted a guide specifically for small entities. And actually, rather than going through my post on this, I'm actually going to click on this and we're going to go to the DOJ guide. Now, this is largely a copy and paste of the fact sheet. So if you have the fact sheet, then you also have much of the small entity compliance guide. I've criticized this guide because this is not just for small entities, right? Someone might come across this and think, oh, I'm part of a population of 50,000 or more. This isn't for me. That is not the case. Everybody needs help with this. And scrolling down, I'm just going to get to the part where we have some differentiation, some real significant differentiation with the small entity compliance guide. And one note here that I wanted to add is the DOJ did provide a very minor being the key word, minor allowance or minor deviation from WCAG 2.1 AA, so long as access is not impacted. This is not something we want to rely upon, but it was a nice affordance by the DOJ. It was a good caveat, is that if there is a slight issue where non-conformance exists, but access is not impacted, then you're not in violation of Title II of the ADA. So reading from the wording here, it says, in some limited situations, state and local governments may be able to show that their web content or mobile apps do not meet WCAG 2.1 AA in a way that is so minor that it would not change a person with a disability's access to the content or mobile app. This is definitely not something to rely upon, but if there should be an issue, it is something that you can come back to and possibly use as a defense. But this last section is where I wanted to go, and it says planning for success. So the DOJ talks about creating a policy, which is what I just went over. The DOJ also talks about really, they don't say the word, they don't say the exact term accessibility statement, but they hinted all around it, and they really described what an accessibility statement is. Why they couldn't just say accessibility statement, I don't know. But here we have creating processes for people to make accessibility requests and report accessibility issues, letting members of the public know in prominent places on your website how they can ask your government to make content accessible when the content falls within an exception to this rule, providing an email address, accessible link, accessible web page, or other accessible way for people to let your government know if there are any accessibility issues with its web content or mobile apps. So again, they talked all around the words accessibility statement. They didn't say them, but that's what this is really getting at. And then we have training your staff. So I've talked about how important training is. Here, the DOJ is also talking about training. It's like a light suggestion for the DOJ, but it really is something that if you're going to be in compliance with this law and you're going to reduce your budget over time, you're going to need to train your staff. You don't want to introduce new accessibility issues after you've invested, let's just say $10,000 in a website. You don't want to invest $10,000, have a fully WCAG conformant website, and then 2 months later, your contractors work undoing the work that's been done. And then, of course, they talked about an accessibility policy, which I've also covered. So you can see the DOJ understands digital accessibility very well. They've been actually, enforcing digital accessibility through private enforcement actions for years before this new update to regulation. So the DOJ is very familiar with accessibility, and the reason I criticize in particular this small entity compliance guide is one, the DOJ knows very well that everybody needs help with accessibility. I think here the idea is that small entities especially need help. Yes, true, and they may not have all of the resources, but this is information that can help everybody. And I had one more point, but we'll go ahead and leave it at that. Let's see if I added anything in my planning for success. No. So I will also link to my write-up on this, because I really elaborate on I elaborate and provide some practical context beyond just what is the light information that was in the small compliance guide. And then here I have training for a public university professor that focuses on making sure course materials meet the requirements of WCAG 2.1 AA. And the reason why I mentioned this random bullet is because these are the kind of things that can unravel what you're doing. I think one of the reasons why the DOJ just now in 2024 came out with an update for digital accessibility is because it is so difficult to create law around digital accessibility, because it's difficult to know when access is provided and when access is not. What's a minor accessibility issue? Even the DOJ in the new rule, they couldn't really define it. They just said it's a minor issue. Well, what is a minor issue? Who knows? And so this is why it's so important to have attention to detail. Accessibility is not about perfection, but the problem is when plaintiffs' lawyers apply the law very strictly, then they really leverage these technical standards and they hold them against website owners when the website owners may actually have a fairly accessible website, but we have these technical standards that are extremely technical. And when you apply them strictly, it's not that hard to find accessibility issues unless someone has really been regimented in their approach. And that, again, gets back to attention to detail. Speaking of professors, I have I have a complete guide on digital accessibility in education. And part of what I focus in on here is the learning management systems. And I actually have a separate article on learning management systems, or LMSs. I have a separate article because this is going to be what the course material, the platform that the course material resides in. So it's very, very important. I will link to both posts below. But schools have so much work to do, in fact, 2 or 3 years, it would have been nice if educational entities had even more time, because there's just so much content involved in education, and we're using different platforms. There may be apps involved, there may be websites involved, software, etc. So schools really need to, schools just have a lot of work ahead of them, but part of that is going to be making sure that your LMS provider is WCAG 2.1 AA conformant, and it is very difficult to come across an LMS platform that is in fact WCAG 2.1 AA conformant. So this is something that schools really have to spend a lot of time when it comes to procurement, and making sure that the provider is not only has a great accessibility base, but is willing to make edits and updates where any other accessibility issues surface. And this is one reason why you want to make sure that a VPAT, or more accurately an ACR, is in place, but you need to look beyond that. So I recommend that you, even if there is an ACR, even if the ACR says we're fully WCAG 2.1 AA conformant, before we go ahead and integrate this and really build our full educational material on this platform, that we make sure that the platform is actually accessible. Because what can happen is you can get an ACR. You can create an ACR yourself. There's nothing outlawing or prohibiting you from creating your own ACR. So that happens sometimes, but also sometimes the wrong people work on ACRs. We don't want an ACR issued by certain accessibility entities, because certain accessibility entities are garbage. Like they're horrible. They produce horrible work. Their quality is very, very low. Their reputation is bad. And so we don't want an ACR from those people either. So this is why I say attention to detail is so, so important, because we're relying on a lot of third parties for our accessibility. So we need to be detailed, and we need to pay attention on so many different aspects of this ADA Title II compliance project. And we are coming up on the last 5 minutes of this stream. So if you do have any questions based on what I said, let me know. I have a complete write-up on the web content exceptions. So I've talked about exceptions previously, but I will include this. I will also include this post in the description. In fact, everything I've talked about will be linked to in the descriptions. So I have covered, let me make sure this is it. Yeah, I've covered what I wanted to. Now I'm just going to talk generally about accessibility. One thing, I mentioned WCAG earlier, and then I said I'd get back to it. With the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, what you have to understand is that these are technical standards and that there are 50, for WCAG 2.1 AA, there are 50 requirements. They're called success criteria. So there are these 50 success criteria. Some are more complex than others. Some are easier than others. Some you likely are already in conformance with. Others you are not. But there are layers to them. And you have to keep in mind that every single page on your website needs to meet all 50 success criteria. So if you think about all of the different layouts that you have, and all of the different content that you have, and all of the different third parties that you're relying upon. So let's say it's your cookie consent screen. Let's say it's your email service provider. Let's say it's your social media embeds. You have all of these different things that you need to account for. And we're going to apply 50 requirements to them. That is a lot of work. And that's the best way I can explain why this is such an extended project. And it's such an involved project, is because there is so much that we need to be aware of. And then you need to understand these technical standards, which is more than it sounds like, because it's not just that we read through them. These are very technical standards that are difficult to understand if you read the actual documentation. So what has happened is myself and many others have created guides and checklists and to help, and materials to help understand these technical standards. But you still have to work through them, become familiar with them, and then incorporate them. So there is a lot involved, and many people just don't understand this, and so they're walking into this project. They hear, you might hear 2 or 3 years and think, well, that's a ways off. We can work on that next year. But there's so much work involved, and it's not just websites, it's not just mobile apps, it's also documents, and we also need to make sure that our social media processes are in place for when that compliance deadline comes due. So there's a lot involved, and I put this stream together because the more information I can put out on this, the better, because people just need to be aware of what this new rule actually means in practice. It's one thing to be aware of it, it's another to put it into practice. There's a lot of work to be done. So knowing that ahead of time, knowing how to approach the project. Remember, I talked about at first, you're going to source out service providers, and then the idea is that we're sourcing out less to service providers over time, because we can preserve our budget, and then also our team that's already in place can take care of most of the work. Sure, maybe there may be additional projects that come up that it's more efficient, it's more effective just to source out, or maybe you want to make sure that any updates you've made are still WCAG 2.1 AA conformant. That's fine, but you have to be aware that there is so much involved that it's easy not to be in compliance with this, and that's in part why digital accessibility laws are so difficult. And what's ended up happening is the lawmakers have looked to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. These are recognized standards. Really, they're known worldwide, and they are the standard. So the lawmakers have incorporated this technical standard. The difficulty for people who are trying to be in compliance is these technical standards while it sounds simple to say WCAG 2.1 AA, in practice, it is anything but simple, especially if you are new to accessibility, which many public entities are. So that's going to include this live stream. Although nobody chatted, we did have several people that dropped in. So thank you for watching the stream. And I will continue to have live streams, and we will continue to put out more information. But for the time being, I encourage you to visit. I'm going to link to the ADA Title II guide that is currently on the screen. I encourage you to read this guide first, and then also read the materials published by the DOJ. And so we will have all sorts of we will have links to everything that I've discussed, and these materials will help inform you and help you take a much better approach, much more efficient and much more effective, in that you will get to compliance faster and with less money and less resources than you might have if you had not started with this knowledge. And then Amy commented, "Thank you for your wealth of information." Absolutely. Thank you very much for commenting. I really appreciate you also stopping in and joining this live stream, Amy. But this is what it takes, right? Like now, I think many people will come to the realization that, when they start working on it, on accessibility, it's much more involved than what you might have anticipated. So I think we will see more entities covered by Title II working on accessibility soon, but it can't be soon enough. So I will end the stream there. Amy, thank you for commenting. And we will have streams every Monday, and I likely will start having streams on Thursday. So I'm going to actually go to the YouTube channel right now so that I can point out, if you want to be aware of the streams, where they are. So let's go ahead and go to youtube.com/@ADAbook. And then we are currently live streaming, so you can see that live stream. But if you go on the page, and near the center of the page is a navigation bar, we have home, video, shorts, and then live. I just clicked on live, and that will show you the streams that are scheduled. And then that will also show you the past streams that I've had. There is a lot of good information on these streams, and it's me more talking candidly than my other videos. In my other videos, I have a way of being more structured, and I actually prefer the live streams because I just flow through things, and if I make a mistake, I don't try to remake the video. But this there's so much to know about from all different types of angles, whether you are trying to be in compliance, whether you are a service provider, whether you are looking for clients, what clients need. There is such a demand and a need for accessibility professionals. We see this with the jobs. There are so many accessibility coordinator jobs being posted. So there's a lot to learn, but this will help you have a really good start, and it will accelerate your knowledge. And I am going to end the stream here. So thank you very much to everyone.